Alright, hello ladies and gentlemen. Today, by request of some of my viewers, we'll be doing kind of just a rough general introduction into Magic the Gathering, basically how to play if you're coming in as a beginner. Um, we'll try to get through it, and I'll try to explain it the best I can through the videos here. I'll probably end up splicing in some other footage as well to better demonstrate certain situations as they come up. We'll be running just a mono blue tempo deck. It's one of the more basic decks that I could think of right now to run and actually get a decent enough demonstration of multiple different mechanics that are throughout Magic. So we'll hop into the game here. I think I'm getting a little bit of frame lag, but hopefully it's not too bad. Man, it's just really laggy. Alright, so when you first start a game of Magic, typically you'll want to run 60 cards in your deck for standard. So you'll start out, you'll draw 7 cards, and then you get an option to choose whether or not you want to mulligan your opening hand, which, as it says here, it'll replace the 7 cards you have with 6 new ones. If you do end up mulliganing down, then you draw your 6. If you decide to keep that, you get to do what's called a scry, which is where you get a look at the top card of your deck, and you can either decide to keep that on top or put it to the bottom of the deck, depending on the needs for your hand. So this hand right here is a pretty good opening hand for this type of deck. I've got 2 lands, which in other decks might be on the light side, but here I have 4 1-drops and then a 2-drop. Well, 2-drop once this is on the board. So this would be a good opening hand, which I would end up keeping in a normal game. So we'll do this. So each turn, each player has a certain number of phases that they go through. So he passed his turn, coming back to me. So I have what's called an upkeep step. So upkeep is where I untap all my lands, and then if there's any upkeep costs, I pay them there. You then go to your draw step, where you draw your first card for turn, and then you go to your first main phase. Now on your first main phase, you can play lands, you can play creatures, you can play anything else that you would like to play that you have the mana available to do. So I played my 1 land for turn, and now I will play my creature using that 1 land. So I'm all tapped out, so there's nothing else I can do in my first main phase. So then you move on to combat. I can't attack because whenever a creature comes into play for the first time, they have what's called summoning sickness. So I can't attack. So I go to my end step, which is where again I can activate abilities and do other things, and then just pass to end my turn. Normally you're not going to stop on your upkeep. There's certain cards that you would want to do that, such as like a treasure map, where you can get a scry for your first scry before you draw, so that way you can see what you're going to draw before you do it. So this is an enchantment. Enchantments can either go on creatures, lands, or not on anything and just affect the game overall. So this one's a creature enchantment. So I'll move to attack and go ahead and attack here. So the ability of Curious Obsession is whenever it deals combat damage to a player, I can draw a card. So I will draw a card. Now there's things called instants, which is what this one is here. Instants can be played in response to anything. So say opponent plays a creature or goes to move from his first main phase into his attack phase or into his second main phase or his end step, anytime he's transitioning from one of those phases or playing a creature, I could then play this instant. I'm not going to now because it doesn't affect what he's got here. So, opponent has a really good opener right now, so this might be difficult to win. So one of the downsides to Curious Obsession, if you call it a downside, is it has to attack every turn, or else you have to sacrifice the enchantment to it. So that's why I'm always pretty much forced to attack with that. So this one here, this is a counter spell. So everything that a person plays... Okay, well, that's worse. Everything a person plays is a spell. There's creature spells and there's non-creature spells. So creature spells can only be countered by things that say counter target spell or counter target creature spell. Stuff like, I don't have it in my hand now, but stuff like spell pierce or negate. Here, I'll show you negate. So stuff like negate here. Negate says counter target creature spell or counter target non-creature spell. So if I tried to play this to counter his Zerta Goblin, it wouldn't do anything. It would just kind of fade into nothingness. Man, opponent is popping off with his deck right now. We might be able to stay with this. Opponent got it. Hit the 2 Gruul Spellbreakers early hurt us. That's a rough introduction to the phases and then what you can do with that. I will try to explain some stuff a little bit better here. So there's a thing called the stack, which is what Magic the Gathering and everything you want to play in Magic revolves around a thing called the stack. So the stack, say it's forest. I have a forest here, so I have my land for turn. Say you'll have multiple of these out as it's later in the game. So now say I try to cast Llanowar Elf, which is just a 1-drop, so I pay my 1 mana. This card now goes onto the stack. So it's on the stack, and opponent can either choose to let it resolve, which will resolve the whole stack and then move into the next, either it'll move to the next phase or move until one player casts another spell. Now, if this player here wanted to respond to that, say with an Essence Scatter. Essence Scatter is counter target creature spell. So you can think of it as Llanowar Elves was the first card played, then Essence Scatter here was played right on top of it. So when you go to resolve the spells, Essence Scatter would resolve first, which would end up countering this spell, so this spell would go away, would end up in the graveyard. Now, say this person was running a little bit of blue mana as well, and they really, really wanted their Llanowar Elf to resolve. Well, the stack is still counting all the cards on top of it, and so this player down here can then play a card like Negate, which counters target non-creature spell. So you're basically building like a structure. You're starting from the ground level. So this is your foundation. This would be the first floor, and then this would be the second floor coming on top of it. Now, when you're tearing the house down to start building another one, you usually start from the top down. So the Negate would resolve, which would end up countering the Essence Scatter. So then this would go away, which means the Llanowar Elf was never countered in the first place. So then the elf would hit the battlefield, this would go to the graveyard, and then this would go to the graveyard. And then you have your creature on the board. That's a rough look at how things on the stack work. Stacks can get pretty crazy, and they can pile up on top of each other, and you can make a pretty tall house if you get there. Because then, say you really wanted to counter the Llanowar Elf, you have a Llanowar Elf countered with Essence Scattered. The Essence Scatter gets countered by Negate, and then say the opponent then plays Cancel, which is counter target spell, which could counter any one of these. Then Cancel would resolve. This would resolve, which would counter the Negate, which would then allow Essence Scatter to resolve, which would then counter the Llanowar Elf. So you can kind of see how it just works its way down. These are 3 basic counter spells that you'll end up running into. One's counter target creature, one's counter target spell, one's counter target non-creature. Negates and Essence Scatters are cheaper to play because they're specific. So this one, you can only do it for a creature, so you can only play it against Llanowar Elves. Non-creature, so say I tried to play Broken Bond to destroy target artifact or enchantment, Negate could counter that one, whereas Essence Scatter could not. Cancel, being a little bit more expensive, can counter either one of these two. It has its benefits, but at the same time, it costs more. So you have more options, but it costs more in order to be able to counter what you want. So that's the basics for how the stack works. Next I'll get into different types of cards. So you have stuff called creatures, you have different enchantments, you have sorceries, and you have instants. Like these. Instants. Here's another creature. So, creatures typically can only be played at what we call sorcery speed. So that means they can only be played on your turn. During either your main phase, your first main phase, or your second main phase. Those are the only times you can play a creature. Now, cards like Fairy Duelist here have an exception, which I'll get into here in just a little bit. But creatures only on first main phase or second main phase. That's going to be the exact same with enchantments, and that's going to be the same with sorceries. Enchantments only on first main phase or only on your second main phase after combat. Instants can be played at any time. Anytime in response to something. So if it's in response to a player going to combat, in response to me casting Llanowar Elf, I can then, in response, play Essence Scatter to counter that. Also, which I'll get into why Fairy Duelist is a little bit different, is there's a little bit of text here called Flash. Flash makes cards act as though they are instants. So Fairy Duelist here can be cast at any time in response to something. So, say I'm in combat and I'm going into attack. So, Llanowar Elf is going to attack. I can then, in response, flash in, which is at instant speed, Fairy Duelist, and use this card to block this card. Flash is typically going to be a blue mechanic. Most flash spells are going to be blue. Some of it is green, but mainly blue is where you're going to have the flash. Flash is not limited to just creatures. There are cards like enchantments that have flash, which lets you flash in something to equip to another creature or something like that. So that's the flash mechanic there. Let's see what else we need to go over. That's mostly what you're going to end up with as a rough introduction.